Just wanted to welcome you to TLL's last speaker series of the year. My name is Lourdes Salaman. I'm one of the Teaching and Learning Associate Directors of Teaching and Learning at the TLL. So for those of you who are new to our series, the goal of the TLL speaker series is to disseminate evidence-based teaching practices to our MIT broader community. And this year's series is focusing on insights that we have gained, hopefully, through navigating the unique challenges that the pandemic has placed on our students and our teaching community. We are incredibly grateful to have Professor Justin Reich, one of our very own, to come and speak about a series of research exercises he and colleagues conducted in spring and August of 2021 with K-12 teachers and students to better understand the experiences of learning and teaching during the pandemic. So the themes that actually emerged from those facilitated conversations are community, healing, and humanity, which Justin will speak more about. And I just wanted to say that these are also themes that have emerged in our own smaller scale efforts within the TLL to highlight pedagogical innovations in MIT classrooms during the pandemic. This culminated in a series of faculty interviews and panel discussions that we titled Fresh Perspectives, and which you can find within a link within the chat. So as you listen to today's seminar, I really encourage you to think about the parallels between the findings in Professor Reich's, that Professor Reich will highlight, and your own work with students on campus. And I also would like you to think about the implications of serving and teaching students who would have spent the majority of their high school time learning during the pandemic with incoming classes. At the end of the seminar, you will have the opportunity to engage in facilitated Q&A and also offer up any of your own reflections if you so want to. So to help us with surfacing questions during the seminar that we can later answer, we're going to be using Slido, which if you've been here before, you would have seen. We're going to be posting the link of Slido in the chat. And I just ask you to please refrain from using the chat to ask questions, but definitely you can use the chat to share with each other any resources that are available to you. But for questions, please post them in the chat. Justin Reich is an associate professor of digital media in the Comparative Media Studies and Writing Department at MIT. And he's also the director of the Teaching Systems Lab. He's the author of Failure to Disrupt: Why Technology Alone Can't Transform Education, and the host of the Tech Lab podcast. He earned his doctorate from the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And actually, he started his career as a high school history teacher and coach of wrestling. His writings have been published in Science, Proceedings of National Academy of Science, The Washington Post, The Atlantic, and other scholarly journals and public venues. And we are incredibly grateful to have him here today. So thank you so much, Justin, for coming, and take it away.
Great. Lourdes, thanks so much for having me. Thanks everybody for joining. So as Lourdes said, my name is Justin Reich, and I'm a faculty member at MIT. I run a lab called the Teaching Systems Lab. And what we're supposed to be doing day in and day out is studying the future of teacher learning. A lot of our work happens in partnership with schools. And so when schools shut down in March of 2020, it sort of prevented us from doing a bunch of research, but it also made us realize that we had a role to play in helping understanding what was going on in schools. So over the past 2 years, we've published a series of reports, which are all at tsl.mit.edu/COVID-19. And the two I'm going to focus on are our two most recent: Healing, Community, Humanity, and the teachers have something to say. What I'll say about the whole enterprise generally is that one of our observations when we started seeing research emerge from the pandemic is that folks seem really interested in two questions in particular. Which schools were open and under what teaching conditions? And then how are students doing on standardized assessments? Those are reasonable questions to ask. In our view, they missed really the most important first order question, which is, what is the experience of teachers and students in classrooms during the course of the pandemic? all teaching and learning happens in a place that my late colleague Richard Elmore at the Harvard Graduate School of Education called the instructional core. The instructional core is when teachers and students and the resources they use to learn meet. And that's really the only place that learning happens. There's all kinds of other stuff that school systems do. They give tests, they run buses, they have all kinds of other things going on. But if you really want to understand what's happening in teaching and learning, it all happens at the intersections of students and teachers and the resources they have. And so we wanted to try to understand what that looked like. We had 3 research strategies that we used most recently to do that. We interviewed about 60 teachers from all across the country. We actually had done a group of 50 teachers in April and May of 2020, and then we did another group of 60 teachers in April and May of 2021. Public school, private school, charter school, elementary, middle, high school, English, science, math, language arts, music, PE, north, south, east, west, kind of a really broad cross section. We also really wanted to understand student experiences. And the way that we did that is that we generated, I'll show you later, kind of a mini survey, 5 questions that we had teachers discuss with their students. And then teachers gathered some evidence from those questions and sent it back to us. So we had about 250 teachers interview about 5,000 students and send us their feedback from that exercise. And then we did a series of about a dozen design charrettes where we brought together teachers, school leaders, family members, other stakeholders, students to imagine what reopening school this year might look like. So we did that over the course of this summer. So those are sort of the 3 data sources that I'll be talking from today. Remember, is it's really trying to understand what was going on in the lives of teachers and students during this period, and what can we learn from those experiences, those feelings, those insights that can help us do better moving forward. And as Lourdes said, I think there's some of the things, for those of you who are really mostly interested in higher education, I think there's some of those things which just have some cognate to what's going on at MIT or other places. I think the other thing to realize is that, if a student went to a high school that goes from 10th grade to 12th grade, when they show up at college next year, their entire high school experience will have been during the pandemic. They will not have had one full year of what we think of as normal pre-pandemic high school. And so some of the kinds of experiences that I hope to share today, I think can feed in to how we think about the freshmen that are going to show up this fall. So with that as preface, let me keep going along here if I can find my button. Here's just some broad overall themes from lots of different things that we found. As much as the pandemic is a global shared experience, everyone is having a different pandemic. For some students, the last 2.5 years have been devastating. They've lost loved ones, they've had an incredibly different time, the changes in schools have been really hard for them. There were also a number of students who really thrived in some of the changes in remote learning. They are for sure a minority, but there were some students for whom remote learning worked really well. There are many stories of students who get special education services who were devastated by the loss of those services during the pandemic. There are other stories, some that we've captured in our research, of students who get special education services who particularly thrived during this period because being in classrooms with lots of other students with the routines that we use really weren't working for them and their learning. There are other students who experience bullying, who experience racism, who experience other kinds of things in schools who got to be at home in the loving arms of their family and really thrived. So as much as school, there's also people who thrived academically and suffered socially, people who suffered academically and thrived socially, and just in so many ways, even as much as the experience of the pandemic was shared, everyone was having a different pandemic. If you lived in a community which had reasonable access to broadband, you had a very different experience during remote learning than if you lived in a community with very, very poor access to broadband. Things that kind of worked in some communities could be a total disaster, just miles away if there are differences in people's access to the internet. What did teaching and learning in classrooms, particularly during remote periods, look like? there were two dominant technologies of remote schooling, and it turns out that they are two of the very oldest technologies that we have. If you look at what schools did to make remote learning work, the two main tools they used were well, the first was learning management systems. These are things like Schoology, Google Classroom, Canvas. They basically are tools to have students and teachers pass documents back and forth. So my daughter right now, back in school in Arlington, Massachusetts, she's got a folder in her backpack. It says to home on one side and to school on the other. And it's how things go back and forth between students and teachers and home. And that's what Google Classroom does digitally. Learning management systems were theorized in the 1960s and 1970s. They were made commercialized in the 1990s. They were made open source in the 2000s. They're one of the oldest, most comfortable education technologies that we have. And the second technology, which I'm sure has dominated your lives over the last couple of years, when it was introduced in the 1930s, was called video telephony. We have almost 90 years of trying to make video mediated communication at a distance work. And interestingly, what the vast majority of schools ended up doing was using these two technologies to reproduce as closely as possible the routines of typical in-person classrooms. If you had talked to experts in instructional design, in December of 2019, and told them all the schools would have to close, no one would have recommended that you simply try to reproduce in-person class at home, because there's all kinds of research that suggests that the best models of online learning just look different than in-person teaching and learning models. But for a variety of reasons, including an exhausted and overworked faculty corps, the conservatism of education systems, this is sort of largely what we ended up with. Now, these two core technologies were sort of supplemented by a series of additional, mostly disciplinary tools. So in addition to Zoom and Google Classroom, people usually got a math app like Dreambox or Desmos, a reading app like Epic or Newsela, maybe some other content area things like BrainPop, and then maybe a collaboration thing like Flipgrid or something else like that. In March and April of 2020, individual teachers were sending home students with these logins. If you were a middle school teacher, if you're a parent of a middle school student, your kid had 7 teachers, each of whom sent home 3 logins, and then you had 21 things to deal with, and it was a disaster. And so last year, schools shifted more towards just choosing a sort of narrower set of these things to use. Moving into this year, I think we found that in places in which the technology infrastructure was really a disaster, there's a strong desire to get away from all this stuff. Like if this wasn't working last year, then people are trying not to use it and to go back to what they're more comfortable with. I think in most other places, we're not finding sort of sweeping changes this year, but rather, some folks discovered that Desmos works pretty well for teaching middle school math, and they're using it a little bit more fluently, a little bit more commonly. Certainly much more use of video conferencing for parent-teacher conferences and home communications and things like that. Some sort of incremental changes from from how technology had been historically used in classrooms. And to some extent, that should come as a bit of a surprise, at least if you had spent the last 2 decades listening to education technology enthusiasts who are telling us that we're on the cusp of this revolution in education where intelligent tutors, MOOCs, all this other stuff are going to completely transform our schools. But what instead happened is that schools overwhelmingly adopted some of our oldest technologies to replicate traditional classroom practices. So that sort of helps us think of 2 paradoxes of the pandemic. The first is that, with incredible blood, sweat, tears, late night, unbelievable efforts of teachers around the world, we dramatically changed the operation of schools. But in this way that we made a kind of online kabuki version of in-person schooling. We made an online version of schooling, which was sort of as close as we could be to what we were doing anyway. And during that process, teachers showed extraordinary capacity for change and innovation. There's so much over the last 2 years that we thought was fixed, was immovable, was the way things always had been, was the way they always needed to be. So many of those things we discovered were malleable and plastic and changeable and contingent. We did an interview with a group of high school teachers in Madison, Wisconsin. And one of the lines we heard from one of their staff was, "We know how to change. We've been changing every 3 weeks for the last 2 years, and we know how to change now. If you're someone who's excited about improving schools, that's a really exciting feeling and sentiment to have sort of coursing through schools. But at the same time, that sense of possibility is matched by a world historical level of exhaustion. Teachers are really, really tired. The incredible work that teachers have done, combined with a sort of superheating labor market, making it difficult to hire substitute teachers and other kinds of things, bus drivers, food staff, other sorts of things. It's an incredibly difficult time to be working in schools right now. So one of the challenges that I'm often thinking about is how can we try to harness some of that energy for change and improvement and innovation, and connect it with some healing, some energy, some stabilization, but not just have it sort of return to normal, but really have it lead us sort of moving forward, harnessing that energy, not just for an emergency, but for the continuous improvement in schools. So as we've, and I do a lot of this work with my colleague Jal Almeida, who's at Harvard, as we've read and thought about and listened to others talk about what K-12 schools will look like this year in the future, we really hear 3 kinds of stories. The first of those stories is a sort of status quo ante pandemus, a back to normal sort of story. Like, how quickly can we have the schools in 2022 look like the schools of 2019? I think as Omicron is hitting, as schools are basically experiencing long COVID. For those of you who live in affluent neighborhoods, you may have the experience that school is like more or less back to normal this year. And you know, in a lot of very fortunate places it is. There are many, many places where school is not back to normal this year, where the combination of low levels of staffing, high levels of underlying student stress, and some real challenges related to social maturation, a sort of mismatch between people's kind of social development and the expectations of schools. There's a lot of schools facing behavioral issues, facing community building issues. Lourdes and I were just talking before this. If you take a moment and go into Google News and do a search for school fights, and nearly every day this year, you will find numerous, stories that hit the local news of fighting that happens at a level that is just unprecedented in schools. Really a crisis that's preventing schools from healing and moving forward. So there's a kind of natural desire to move back to status quo ante pandemus, but also many reasons to believe that this is not, these challenges are not ones that are going to go away quickly. This is going to be a generational challenge for this group of students. A second story about the future of schools is this idea of learning loss, which is that schools supported a certain amount of standards aligned learning in, say, 2018 and 2019. They supported less of that learning during the pandemic. And so that led to this kind of learning loss and learning gap that the main purpose of schools was to remediate that learning loss. That story was unbelievably successful at the federal level. That story was the motivation behind this set of billions of dollars in funding through a stream called ESSER funding, through other kinds of supplementary funds for schools. It was totally compelling to congressional staffing aides and congresspeople and so forth. When we talked to students and teachers, this idea of learning loss just did not resonate with them at all. Some students were very vigorously opposed to being characterized under the rubric of learning loss. We've been doing the work, one student said. They've been learning all kinds of things. For teachers who are opposed to this idea of learning loss, I think some of it is just a natural reaction to not wanting to frame their students as learning losers, to realizing that you don't start building the capacity of wounded people by talking about the things that they've lost. You have to start from their strengths, from their resilience, from a place where you can build forward. But also I think teachers just recognize that learning was not so much lost as really uneven. There's all kinds of things that school systems didn't teach particularly well in the last few years, but there are other things that they did better than they've ever done before. I mean, there are more young people in the United States who know something about technology mediated learning than ever before in the history of the United States. Many students develop skills around self-regulated learning, around independent learning. So this sort of blanket idea of learning loss doesn't capture all of the complexities of what students and teachers saw. And so a third story that emerges for us, and I think Jal and I would both admit we sort of put our thumb on the scale here to some extent, is the idea that there is a way to move forward from the pandemic, which is not just about some kind of magical accelerated learning or going back to what we were doing before, but thinking about reflecting on what we can learn from the experience of the pandemic and how we can systematically make schools that are more humane, more just, and ultimately more effective environments for students to learn. As you Google through the news reports of school fights and other kinds of things, the behavioral community issues, the sort of wrenched communities, those things are not going to be fixed by high dosage tutoring or by lengthening the school day or something like that. They're going to be fixed by communities coming together and thinking about, what is the role of our schools as places of healing, as places of humane development and community. As much as we all would like to go fast, this may be one of those circumstances where going slow is the way to go fast. So part of how we get to this idea of humane reinvention is by talking to young people. So in the spring of 2021, we put together a little website, Imagining September 2021, where we gave teachers a slide deck with 5 questions. And we asked them to have a conversation with their students about these 5 questions, send the results back to us, also send sort of what their interpretations and what they wanted to do differently as a result of these conversations to us, but also talk to other adults in their community. An underappreciated fact of American schools right now is there is exactly one generation of young people there's actually one generation of Americans who's gone to school during a pandemic. Normally one of the advantages that educators have in schools is they kind of know the routine. We've been to schools for 16 or 20 years or whatever it is. But none of us who are old have been to school during a pandemic, which young people are now unfortunately developing quite a bit of expertise around. And we really need their help to see what moving forward looks like. So we had teachers ask students 5 questions. What are the aspects of remote learning that you've appreciated the most and would like to see carried back into in-person schooling? I think if we revise these questions now for January, we'd probably focus less on remote learning and more about, what are the aspects of coming back to school that you've appreciated the most and would like to see carried back into next semester? What was really hard about remote learning that you hope you never have to manage again as a student? What do you hope that adults will do differently next year or will not do differently next year? What do you feel like you missed out on or lost because of the pandemic in school this year? And what are you most proud of this year? What are the strengths and assets that we can build on for you? 3 hours ago, I gave a very similar version of this talk to some of my colleagues in Marlborough, Massachusetts. And one of the principals afterwards raised his hand and he said, we've just been in survival mode for so long. I don't think we've asked our students this question. I couldn't tell you right now what I think our students are most proud of. And asking that question is really important for 2 reasons. One is we sort of need all the good news we can get, and talking with young people about what they're proud of is really nurturing, soul building work. The second thing is the things that students tell us they're most proud of are the assets and strengths that we can use to build on to help our schools heal and to grow and to move forward. We can't fix schools and kids just by looking at the things that are broken in them. We have to find the places where we're strongest, where the foundations or the bones are strongest, and we can build from there. I want to tell you one story about this question. For which we heard some really interesting answers, but this was, we do a bunch of this work with my colleague Nima Avashia, who's an incredible 19-year veteran of the Boston Public Schools. And she helped us design and prototype these questions and ask them first with her middle school students. So we went through a round of these questions. We asked this to a group of her civic students, and one student raised his, what do you want to do differently next year? And a kid raised his Zoom hand and turned his mic on. And he said, the McCormick School should build a pool. And we kind of said, what? We didn't say it out loud because that would be rude. But thinking yourself, what? Why? We're talking about learning loss. We're talking about pandemics. We're talking about remote learning. Why are you talking about a pool? And then the second student raised her hand. She was an incredible young woman, said something along the lines, like food is a blessing and I'm grateful for it, but the food in our school, it's really not very good. Like it's really hard to eat. And kind of on and on. And what we heard from so many students as we asked them these questions was that for them, the most salient challenges to schooling that they saw for the future were not related to the pandemic. They were related to long-standing inequities in our society. Those kids know that kids in the suburbs have pools that are attached to or near their schools and that they don't, and that's not fair. Nima and I often say to each other and to others that if you take students seriously, they will give you serious answers, and the serious answers will shine a light forward about what you ought to be doing next. As much as we should think about how do we recover from the pandemic, part of what students are telling us is, how do we recover from the failure of integration efforts, from retrenching segregation, from the ongoing inequalities in our schools, which are just as salient to young people's lives as the pandemic were. We heard this too from teachers. I mentioned this group of folks in Madison, Wisconsin. We asked them similar kinds of questions, and a teacher said, what we really need for next year is to bring back driver's ed. And again, it was one of these sort of head scratching moments, like, wow, why are we talking about driver's ed? But then you ask more and you dig into it and you find that in their school, they had some survey data that 60% of the students in their high school were wage earners in their family, like not just kids with jobs, but kids who were making money for their family budget. And the public transportation system in Madison is totally ineffective. And so if they wanted students to be able to go to school and do some work and get some homework done, they needed to be able to travel more efficiently. And helping more students get driver's licenses might be one way to fix that. So as we were listening to people talk about this question of what should we do next year, for sure there are some things that were like very closely tied to the pandemic. I mean, one of the most common answers we heard from students was something like, I have been so grateful for the grace and understanding that teachers showed this year. Like, for the first time, it really feels like the teachers kind of get what we're going through, and just appreciate their flexibility and their support through those kinds of things. But there was a lot that we heard to answer these questions. We asked people to think about schools of the future that was about really correcting longstanding inequalities. So I talked a little bit about that third theme. I'll talk about two of the other things that we heard over and over from students and from teachers about lost connections and growing autonomy, and then relationships and communities. So if you ask students what they've lost in the past year, the overwhelming answer is social connectedness and peers. One student says here, online school has made me more of an introvert, hard to make friends and socialize with people, want to stay in my house and not go outside. Young people came into this year with some real concerns about their socialization. And if you talk to educators right now, you'll hear it all over the place. Talking to these folks in Marlboro, saying a bunch of teachers really worried that kindergarten and first grade students couldn't use playground equipment appropriately. Like maybe they need to be referred for occupational therapy. And it's like, no, they don't need to be referred to occupational therapy. They just have never used playground equipment before. Someone's got to show them how to use it because they missed, what we come to think of now as that normal social development. The funniest way I heard this was there was a class, we were interviewing a Boston Public Schools math teacher, 7th grade teacher. And she was telling us about a class that was going off the rails, and kids were getting into it with each other. And one kid turns to her and says, what do you expect, miss? We've got the social skills of 4th graders. I don't know if you've seen that meme, which is kind of like, well, he's out of line, but he's right. But that was the kind of insight that young student has, is that our students miss some important years of social development. And that's feeding into some of the behavioral challenges that schools are having. At the same time, young people also had an incredible degree of autonomy last year. Students learned in environments where they could go to the bathroom when they wanted to, where they could eat when they want to, when they could take a little nap when they wanted to. They turn off their video, they could turn off their teacher's video. I think it's raising some good, solving problems, doing learning without the kinds of support that they're used to. There was one teacher who had a response, which was something like, in talking to my students, I realized there's so many moments in school when we get to the really hard part and we just do the hard part for our students rather than watching them struggle. And we couldn't do that in the distance. And it turned out in a lot of cases, our students they did have the resilience and resolve to do the hard part. This is a quote from my colleague, Nima Avashia, who's also asking, like, so last year our students went to school and they wore sweatshirts, and sometimes when they had their sweatshirts on, they pulled their hoods up and they were still learning. And now we're sending them back to schools and telling them that they can't have their hood up anymore. Like, why? Why not let them keep, they learned just fine last year. Schools are places in which we police the behavior and bodies of young people to a degree far more extensive than many of them experienced last year. And I think part of the tensions that we see right now in schools is adults sort of trying to reimpose a bunch of these structures and young people being like, but I learned just fine without them. Why can't you respect my autonomy? And tensions coming out there, hopefully coming to good questions about which of these policies really help us create powerful learning environments for students, and which of them are policies that are about control and not really about learning that we don't need. When we asked teachers to tell us, having had these conversations with their students, what do you want to do differently next year? We really got a lot of different answers. Sometimes when you do this kind of social science research, you'll ask a question like that and just a few things will bubble up to the surface. But the adults that we talked to took all kinds of different lessons away from the past year. They want to use more technology. They want to use less technology. They want to, figure out how they're going to accelerate learning. They want to try to really focus more deeply on fewer topics, all kinds of things. But two of the most, or maybe three of the most common themes are the importance of relationship and community, and this desire to build on students' newfound sense of autonomy. I love this quotation in the middle here. I need to make so much more space for connecting with students and for students to learn about each other. This is from August, this is, the summer anyway, and really incredibly prescient. I have to stop thinking of community building as one unit at the beginning that I rush through, and how community can play a much larger systemic role in my classroom. All of these schools that are really struggling with behavioral issues, there's so many teachers that are thinking through that specific challenge right now. There's all this idea of accelerated learning, which I think for teachers was frustrating because it sort of envisions that like somewhere high in the mountaintops, there's like a secret temple where we've been maintaining the secret of accelerated learning with kind of like break glass in case of national emergency. We were doing the regular learning for the past decade, but now we need to break out the accelerated learning. And of course, every teacher every year is doing accelerated learning. They're all trying to help people learn as much as they can. But I think there was already some recognition in the spring and summer, and I think much more emerging right now, that sometimes in life you go slow to go fast. And if we can't build up these fundamental community social issues, we're not going to get to the academic learning that is so deeply connected to that. A few other things from teachers. Teachers really did not feel like folks were listening to them this past year. We interviewed about 60 teachers. I think we had about 5 folks doing the interviews. Every one of our interviewers said that they had multiple teachers they interviewed who cried during the interview. That is not normal if you're doing social science research with teachers. For many of the teachers that we talked to, they said that we are the only person who has really listened to them for 45 minutes or an hour about their experience teaching over the last year. And it was really, really hard. And I think they also felt like administrators were making unwise decisions because they didn't understand enough what was happening inside the instructional core. They were thinking about what pieces worked administratively, but not enough about what worked in terms of teaching and learning. Probably the most consequential misstep of the last year was hybrid learning or simul-teaching. Trying to have teachers teach both folks at home and in person at the same time. There's a number of teachers who felt like they were shouting from the mountaintops that just like would not work. And people were like, well, let's try it anyway. And then it didn't work and it got pulled. But it seemed like one of the things that could have been avoided as a policy experiment by listening to folks more. And then I think there's some teachers also told us that there's some exciting things that they had learned and developed and innovated that they wanted to bring forward and share, that they also didn't feel like people were listening them around. Some of that had to do with how they use technology in the classroom. Again, this was a space where a bunch of folks told us about many special education students who really suffered, but other students who access special education services who really thrived. And they found different ways of doing things, lots of stuff around working with parents that I think people found pretty powerful. So, one theme that I think you get from all of this research for anyone who is helping communities come together and grow and move forward from this, it's probably impossible to do that work without listening really closely to the experiences of students and teachers. They're now a whole group of folks who just know more about the challenges of pandemic learning than people who are outside of the classroom do. And listening to them is really crucial. The way my colleague Nima Avashia talks about it, she's a 19-year veteran teacher. And she said that when she went to remote learning, she just felt like a teacher on day one again. It was that hard. But what she found is that in order to figure out the path through, she had to really sit down and talk with her students and find out what was working for them and what wasn't, and where they were at and how they were feeling. And when you ask young people those questions seriously, they give you serious answers, and it shines a light. It doesn't tell you exactly what to do, but it shines a light forward. And then, 6 months later, she's doing hybrid teaching. And again, she's like a day one, first year teacher. So she talks with her students about that again. She comes back to school this year with all different kinds of trauma and challenges. And again, it's about listening to students and figuring out where they're at and talking to the other adults in our community about what they're hearing from students. And then ultimately, talking to teachers about what they're experiencing and sharing that. It's this kind of bottom-up community organizing view of school improvement to some extent. For those of you who are familiar with the work of Marshall Gans at Harvard, it's very much kind of a story of me, story of us, story of moving forward. I'll pass on a few of these things. I'll just talk about a few other exercises that we did with folks and then open it up for Q&A. But these were some of the design exercises that we encouraged folks to do in these design charrettes. One was to ask these 3 questions. What can we amplify from the past year? What worked really well in pandemic schooling that we want to build on? This question, I think, is coming into incredible focus and importance. What should we hospice? What can we let go? What do we not want to do when we come back to school this year, when we move forward to next year? Schools are completely overwhelmed right now. They are on their very, very last shred of energy and sanity. And it's not working in a lot of places. And you can't fix schools that are exhausted and not working by adding on more and more things to do. There has to be some strategic subtraction. We have to find things where we go into schools and say, we're not going to do that anymore. It's not helping us anymore. We have to find places in the curriculum where we say, let's go deeper, but let's not do all of that. We have to find the bureaucratic parts of the system that we can slim down now or for long periods of time. But that question of what we don't want to do is enormously important right now. And then what do we want to create? So we would ask, in Zoom meetings and things like that for people to chat the answers to some of these questions. And we have a whole table full of them, but there's a lot of stuff around trust and relationships, around the reorganization of time, particularly the reorganization of time to let adults work with fewer children. If your problem is that you have sort of insufficient community and trust, there's a huge difference between having 220 students or 160 students and having 60 or 70 students. And there's ways of reorganizing school and time in schools to make that happen. We talked a lot about this idea of Marie Kondoing the curriculum. I don't know if you all are familiar with the great Japanese home organizer, Marie Kondo, but she has this routine where you go into your closet and you put your hand on a piece of clothing and you see whether or not it sparks joy. And if it doesn't, you fold it and give it away. We're trying to have people sort of go through the curriculum, go through schools and put their hands on things and see whether or not it sparks joy. And if not, is there a way to pull that out to focus on other things? We had some empathy exercises that we had folks do, which I think would be a great thing to do again in the close of this year and the beginning of next year. We had people fill out these jam boards, but you could do with all kinds of things. What are the problems that students hope we solve next year? What are the problems that teachers hope we solve next year? What are the problems that families hope we solve next semester? What are the problems that administrators hope we solve next semester? And people find that they're not the same answers to these things. That there's a range of perspectives that folks have, some things that overlap and also some things that are really, really different. And then another exercise that we did is that for a variety of understandable reasons, a lot of schools, as they were providing advice and guidance to teachers and stakeholders, they just end up looking like these 45-point checklists. Here are the 60 things that we're doing to make it safe for you to come back to school next year. And there's reasons why people need to do that. But also people can't remember or organize around really long detailed checklists. We need when schools move forward, it's usually because they have one or two big ideas that they can get a whole community working on together. And so we did a variety of exercises to help people kind of come up with these tentpole ideas, including to start thinking about, what is the metaphor when you start imagining what school in January of 2022 is going to look like? What metaphors come to mind for you? We had folks, talking about this September, talking about family reunions, talking about religious education where they felt really seen and whole, other kinds of metaphors that help people imagine the future. So maybe I'll pause there and see what kinds of questions have come up, and enjoy a conversation with you all and Lourdes and others. But again, if you want to leaf through the report while we're talking, it's at tsl.mit.edu/COVID-19. The healing community and humanity and the teachers have something to say. So I'll stop sharing and look at all of you and look at the chat and see what folks have to say.
Great, thanks so much, Justin. As a reminder to all the participants, we've been collecting some questions in the Slido. There are some there that we're going to start with. You can also raise your hands and ask your question over Zoom. And then in addition to questions, as Lourdes mentioned in the intro and Justin also mentioned in the talk, we're also interested in hearing about ways that you think some of the same things that Justin talked about are also present in the higher education space, and then also how, as we think about welcoming first years to MIT next year, how some of the things that we've learned from Justin's research might inform the way that we work with those students. So I can start with a couple of questions that came through on the Slido. So the most upvoted question is that in education, we tend to focus on what is measured. Was there anything in your exploration that centered on rethinking grades or standardized testing?
Yes, at all kinds of levels. One of the things that got hospice this past couple of years was the SAT-2 subject tests, and of course, all across higher education, SATs and other kind of testing have been hospiced, maybe permanently in a bunch of places, and that will create changes. Some of which we could be excited about, some of which we could be concerned about. Lots of conversations about the degree to which faculty in new kinds of ways sort of extended grace and understanding to their students in ways, just students saying like, man, I felt really just seen and understood by my teachers. Now, I think a lot of folks, especially this semester, are also starting to experience like something of a backlash to that. It's kind of like, the reason why we have, well, first of all, there was definitely a backlash to that going way back to April of 2020 and the start of the 2021 school year. So there's a ton of places that went to pass, fail, no grades, other kind of stuff like this in the very first days of emergency remote learning. And I talked to plenty of progressive educators who was like, do not do that again. That was terrible. Like our students need some of the, what we can't do is replace these structures with nothing. I think there are plenty of learning environments around the country where motivation is built through really compelling questions, deep relationships between educators and students, really rich learning experiences that don't depend nearly as much on grades and other kinds of structures. But if you are basically teaching classes where you're making kids learn stuff because they're supposed to, and you pull those things away, I think there's also a lot of discussion right now about, should you have a late policy during a pandemic? And some people are like, how could you possibly have a late policy during a pandemic like that? How could you know what kids are going through? But then a lot of folks also get rid of their late policies and be like, oh, well, it's because my students aren't doing their work, and they would if I had some kind of late policy. So figuring out what the right balance of grace and understanding and structures, that are ideally being imposed, in a loving, nurturing kind of way to help people thrive. There's always ongoing conversations about ungrading and sort of other approaches to grading and feedback and learning that I think accelerate somewhat during the pandemic. But I think another thing to understand is that we have just experienced the most powerful demonstration of the conservatism of educational systems that any of us will ever live through again. I mean, a giant world-altering event with 800,000 people dead in the United States, millions more around the world, shifting school online, all this kind of stuff. And if you look at what actually happened in schools and higher education, is we were like, how do we keep doing what we were doing before? I mean, my joke in higher education is that faculty members like walked away from their lecterns, sat down in front of their home office webcams, and kept teaching the way they were doing it before. And I don't mean that as, I have no normative stake associated with that question. There's probably some good reasons we did that and probably some shortcomings. But just descriptively, anyone who is hoping that the pandemic in and of itself would be a catalyst of profound structural change in schools, it is not a catalyst of profound structural changes. What's going to lead to improved schools is organizing, not viruses.
Great. There were several questions that talked about exhaustion and burnout. So maybe we'll kind of group those together. So the first question was if there's anything that you learned from your work about how the exhaustion teachers experienced from teaching differently in the pandemic relates to initiative fatigue that they previously experienced from frequent curricular changes.
Yeah, it is certainly the case that your professional experience during the pandemic depended an awful lot on the condition of the school that you worked in. Initiative fatigue can come, in my view, initiative fatigue is like when people are trying new things over and over again without the participation and consent of those who are implementing them or support of those who are implementing them, and they're not really working. There are plenty of places that do lots of initiatives and it's not fatiguing because they make teaching and learning better and it's fun to work with your colleagues to improve things. So like the number of initiatives isn't exactly correlated with how people feel. If you went to a school system with really high levels of trust between teachers and administrators and families, with a sense of priority around community, it was a lot easier to navigate these challenges than schools where that wasn't there as much. I had a really funny conversation with a superintendent who, she was in a district where all of the secondary schools had one-to-one technology and there was basically no technology at the elementary schools. And she thought for sure that the high schools were going to be fine and the elementary schools were going to really struggle, but it turned out to be the exact opposite. And it was the opposite because for all the technology that they had in those schools, in the high schools, they didn't really have like great teacher-student relationships or really sort of adaptivity to where students were at. Like they just kept trying to teach the way with like exactly how they were doing before with the same expectations and it wasn't working. The elementary school teachers didn't know anything about new technology, but they knew their kids and they knew their families and they actually ended up adapting sort of more readily. I think it's, when a system is completely maxed out, it's really hard to figure out how do you build back the energy of actors in that system. Like how are we going to help teachers feel better if like no one even has the energy to help teachers feel better? So I've become really keenly interested in this question of strategic subtraction. Like what is it that we're going to take off of the hands of educators so that they can focus on more important things, including just feeling better? I also I was really struck by how many teachers we talked to just did not feel like someone had ever listened to them. I was thinking today that if I was a school administrator who had responsibility for doing like teacher observations and stuff like that, I would can the teacher observation, take all the time that I was going to devote to that and be like, just come and sit down and talk with me and tell me about your experience. Tell me about your experience and what I can do to support you, and making time for those one-to-one kinds of things. Sarah talks about caseload differences. That was maybe one of the only places where we saw some movement to some kind of structural change. There are not many, but there are a handful of places that like switched from a full year school model to a semester model. So basically, instead of having students taking 6 classes at once all year, they were taking 3 classes at once at a time. And one of the main reasons for doing that was reducing the number of students being engaged by each teacher and the number of teachers being engaged by each student. I mean, I think a lot of schools, I wish more, but I think there were a bunch of schools who started thinking about, what is the interface for a student and a family to an institution? Like, where is there one, like, if there's no one point of contact, if it's just a whole bunch of different teachers, each of whom has their own needs, we'll do that. While Hugo tees up the next question, my office has this thing where the sun sets in such a way that it's now blasting me. So I have to go lower my shades, but I'm listening.
Cool. Hugo, go ahead.
Hi there. Thanks so much for taking my question. First of all, Justin, I've really enjoyed your book, by the way. I thought really enjoyed it. So thank you for that.
And the $20 check is in the mail.
I'm now doing my master's at UCL in EdTech, having been teaching for the last two years in the pandemic, and found a lot of kids dropping off, and it helped with sort of trying to engage with the families and things like that. But an awful lot of them just simply weren't self-regulated learners. And I know you touched on this in your book as regard MOOCs and things like that, and certainly older learners. I was wondering if you'd come across anything in your research that particularly helped with keeping students on board and trying to help them be better self-regulated learners online, and especially given a lot of my students were refugees and coming from fairly difficult backgrounds. I was wondering if you'd sort of come across anything in that regard.
I mean, only that school systems ramped up their connections to kids and families in ways that, they never had before. Doing home visits, distance home visits, remote, virtual home visits, just like trying to build those relationships that keep people engaged. Trying to provide the right level of information to families, which doesn't sort of, overwhelm them, but keeps them up to date about attendance and other kinds of things. It's the way people, as far as I can tell, the way people get better at self-regulated learning is when they have a really good apprenticeship in the formal education system. You get better at self-regulated learning by going to school. That's not, Ben Franklin didn't do it that way, but the vast majority of us do. And part of it too is some of these challenges are beyond the scope of schools as institutions to be able to handle. There's a colleague of mine at Harvard, Paul Revel, who runs a lab called the Ed Redesign Lab. He works with mayors in municipalities to develop these things called children's cabinets, where you ask the mayor to bring together the schools person and the health person and the parks person and the public safety person, and basically anyone whose lives touch children, to start at social services, to start asking the question, like, what are all of the things that we can do in town to support kids? In lots and lots of places in the United States, as kind of public society, one of the things we learned is that schools play an unbelievably disproportionate role in the social safety net of kids and families. And it's crazy because we need schools to do teaching and learning. I'm unbelievably grateful for the millions of teachers and administrators who went all out to make sure that their kids were fed and housed and safe and all those other kinds of things. But it's not what they should have had to be doing. We should be building a society where there are other people that can do health screening, mental health screening, taking care of the basic welfare needs of families. To some extent, technology is another example. It was driving me crazy during the pandemic when people are like, why aren't the superintendents getting more, technology out in the hands of kids? And it's like, our school superintendents are not supply chain managers. They're not going to roll fiber optic cable up the holler. When we needed to electrify America, we didn't go to school principals and be like, we need to, have linesmen running out to wire homes so kids can read at night. We built other institutions in society to do that. And it was amazing that schools stepped up the way they did, but in a better future, they wouldn't have had to. Incidentally, another piece that I've written recently is this idea of Schooling for the Fifth Season, which is a riff off this beautiful set of books by N.K. Jemisin about a society that's sort of riven by climate change periodically. What we're seeing in the interruptions that we saw in schooling over the last year and what we're going to see in the future, it's only going to become more common. As schools are going to deal with more fires, more floods, more freezing events. Schooling is going to be more interrupted in the future. And very sadly, the pandemic that we just experienced is a dress rehearsal for the kinds of disruption that we should expect in the future. And so part of what we need to think about is how do we make our systems of schooling and learning more resilient to these kinds of interruptions and changes.
So I note that we're closing in on the top of the hour, and so that we don't necessarily end our session all reflecting on climate dread. One of the questions that was asked in the Slido that I want to ask is if you can share some examples of things that students were most proud of, your fifth question in those 5 questions as you lit, and whether there are any examples or any overarching themes to students' responses to those questions.
One of my favorite ones, I don't know if it was the next, but my grades this semester were fire. There are a lot of kids who did great. There are a lot of kids who will tell you man, you get me away from my friends and just like make me sit at home and do my work. That's terrific for me. Like, it turns out that's really good for me. There are a ton of kids who are incredibly proud of the resilience that they showed, that things were really hard. And they'll say in a way that sounds cheeky, but I think is real, like, man, I survived. I don't know, my daughter, who's 11 years old, her mantra has, I mean, this is a little grim for an 11-year-old, but it's still here. You know, I'm still here, you'll still here, like you all haven't gotten me yet. And that resilience matters, and we should celebrate that. There are lots of, you know, kids learn so much about technology mediated learning. They learn so much about independent learning, and not that they're doing it perfectly. They're having all kinds of challenges that Hugo described, but I bet even a lot of the ones that are having a lot of challenges got better at it too. And I think, you know, asking young people those questions, asking our students that question. If you're looking for something to wrap up, it's a little late here, but another routine I really like for this kind of thinking is I used to think, but now I think, as a great way of getting people to reflect on the changes in their thinking. You know, but especially for people who are working with folks all year or multiple years or over time and things like that, the things that people answer to that question, that is the source of strength and resilience and assets that we can build on. I mean, I said this before, but we can't make our schools better just by finding things that are broken and fixing them, or make kids better by finding the broken things in them and fixing them. We need to build on the strengths and assets that we're finding and have strength and maturity and growth and learning emerge from those places, not just patching in the cracks that we see.
Great. Okay. So it's 2:00, so I think we can bring the speaker series to an official close. Thanks so much, Justin, for this really exciting talk, helping us to see the connections to teachers outside of the sort of higher ed bubble and see how so many of the things that we're all working with are so similar, and how much we can learn from one another. Thanks so much again to all the participants as well, who had great questions and great engagement throughout the talk.
Bye, everybody. Thank you. Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Loris.